Jesus' resurrection. First, I think we need to be clear, why does it matter? So why do we care that Jesus rose from the dead? And what's the big deal? A lot of other cool things happen in the Bible. We had floods, we had whales, we had Revelation, we had all kinds of interesting things. So why, if I'm going to give you an explanation of why Jesus rose from the dead and why that's important, why do you care? So let me give you a few reasons why that is. One of which is the impact on the Bible. So Paul wrote somewhere between, depends on what scholar you listen to, somewhere between 6 and maybe 7 or 8 to 13 or 14 books of the Bible. So Paul wrote a lot of the Bible. Second thing is that a lot of the prophets in the Old Testament predicted that Jesus would rise. Okay, it's important to keep that in mind too. And finally, Jesus himself indicated that he would rise from the dead. So why that's important is if we throw away some of the comments that Paul said, and Jesus, let me say, if Jesus didn't die on the cross, we have to start throwing away large chunks of what Paul said. We have to start throwing away large chunks of what the prophets indicated, and finally what Jesus said. So what happens if we don't think that Jesus rose from the dead, Paul had it wrong, now you start to question, well, what else did Paul have wrong? What else did Jesus have wrong? What else did the prophets have wrong? And as a result, you start throwing away large chunks of the Bible. And that's the situation as Christians we don't want to be in. That's not an argument for the fact that we know Jesus rose from the dead. All I'm saying is that if Paul lied about that, he might lie about other things. And therefore, what we believe in, our faith based on the Bible, in Jesus' resurrection, we have to start throwing all that stuff away. Second reason why it's important that we know that Jesus rose from the dead was that if Jesus rose and died like any other man, he just became worm food, if you will, the term I like to use. It just goes to show there's nothing else out there. We live, we die, we get buried, not a big deal. And so that as Christians is hard to swallow. Again, not a reason to say why Jesus rose from the dead, but just trying to get you to understand the importance of why we have to be clear on Jesus rising from the dead and why that's important. And finally, a test. So one thing, if you think about world religions, let's say Mormonism or Islam or Christianity, they all say that the believers feel it in their heart, right? I'm a believer, I listen to K-Love, I feel it right here, the Holy Spirit. That stuff's fantastic. But what Jesus' dying on the cross did for us that's unique, unlike any other religion, is it provided a test. It said basically, hey, I'm going to die on the cross, and I'm going to rise from the dead. And if I don't do that, you know I'm a liar, because I'm saying I'm going to do it. That's a differentiator from Mormonism or Islam or many other religions that simply say, hey, I feel it in my chest. Because the problem is if everybody says they just feel it, well, I can't tell if you're right or wrong, right? We all feel it. And so I think Jesus is dying on the cross and then rising was an important indicator, important proof, if you will, that Christianity is different than those other religions. So that's why it matters. In fact, Corinthians says, if there's no resurrection of the dead, then not even Jesus Christ raised. And more importantly, if he has not risen, preaching is useless, also is your faith, and is your faith. So bottom line is, if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, we've got a big problem, right? Your faith is invalid. So I think it's really important that we think about and convince ourselves that Jesus arose from the dead. All right? So I'm going to do that by approaching it more from an apologetics approach. I'm not going to try to preach the Bible at you. I'm going to give you some facts, and I call it just the facts, right? And I'm going to give you 4 facts that we know, and I'm going to tell you what I mean by fact in a second. And then we're going to look at those facts, and then we're going to say, okay, what story best fits those facts? So notice I'm not starting from the Bible and trying to explain, hey, using this miraculous thing, let me use that to prove the Bible. I'm starting with facts, and we're going to go work back to the story. Okay, these facts have to meet 2 criteria. So I'm going to show you 4 facts. They have to meet 2 criteria, one of which is they have to be agreed upon by all unanimous number of scholars, both Christian, more importantly, non-Christian. Okay, so there's little dispute about some of these facts. So not just Christians. We're not a bunch of homers listen to Christian scholars, all Christians. Second thing is that facts have to be evidenced by historical information. It has to be something written, something we've seen or touched or tasted, right? So those are the 2 criteria for all the facts. Unanimous agreement by all types of scholars and some historical evidence. All right, so I'm going to give you 4 facts. Fact number 1, Jesus died due to crucifixion. Rob talked about this a couple weeks ago, but I just want to hit this home a little bit more clearly. How do we know Jesus died from crucifixion? Well, First off, let's be honest. The Romans were really good at killing people, right? Particularly with crucifixion. This wasn't a one-off thing where Jesus was crucified and, hey, wow, I've never seen that before. Romans crucified people all the time. They knew how to do this. This wasn't anything special, okay? So let's give them some credit, right? That's first supporting fact. They knew how to kill people. Second thing, I want you to realize that when you look at historical evidence for anything, the existence of Rome, you name it, scholars would say if I have two independent sources of historical evidence, I'm really happy. Most of what you know about history is based on one person writing, but if you have two pieces of historical evidence, you feel pretty good that you know what you read about history was something that was likely true. In the case of Jesus dying due to crucifixion, we have 5 independent sources of historical evidence. Okay, Jews too. Right? These were Christians. Again, these were people that a lot of them were anti-Christianity. 5 independent sources. They didn't know about each other. Wrote independent times. That's an overwhelming amount of evidence for anything in history. One of these, Rob talked about a couple of weeks ago, this fellow named Tacitus. Tacitus was called the greatest Roman historian. And he was pretty much the man. He wrote a lot of books on this subject. In fact, most of what you know about Rome and history of Rome, how the government worked, how the monetary system worked, came from Tacitus. So I want you to keep in mind that there's a lot of historical evidence for the fact that Jesus died due to crucifixion. If you start throwing away these people like Tacitus, you have to throw away a ton of stuff you know about ancient history, not just Rome, right? Because this is a lot of people, a lot of evidence. So fact number 1, right? Jesus died on the cross. A lot of evidence for that, okay? With me? Dominic Crossan, who is just one little quote from him. He says, well, let me tell you who he is. So Dominic Crossan is a Christian. He's on our side, but he's a skeptic of everything written in the Bible about Jesus, that Jesus says in the Bible. So he's a guy that says, yeah, I believe in the Bible, but I'm not sure that Jesus said those words or did those things. It's a pretty famous scholar. Why I bring it up is he's a skeptic, and even he says that he was crucified was as sure as anything we know in history. Okay, if you're intellectually honest and think about what you know and agree about history, this fact is about as sure as one can be about anything historical in the Bible. Okay, that's fact number 1. He died on the cross. Fact number 2, the disciples believed it. Right? So how do we know the disciples believed it? A couple of reasons. One of which is an acronym they call POW, right? So we know the disciples believed that Jesus rose from the dead, or died and rose from the dead because of Paul's writing. Paul says in his writing that the disciples preached it. Now, Paul also said he was the best preacher, but he said the disciples preached the fact that Jesus rose from the dead. Second thing, oral tradition. So oral tradition from the disciples passed down, right, over the years and ended up being in the Bible, also said that they believed that Jesus died and rose from the dead. Okay, so oral. And finally, written tradition. So a lot of the creeds we have in the Bible were passed down that clearly indicate that the disciples believed that Jesus rose from the dead. Okay, there's some evidence. So another thing about the disciples, think about how the disciples were before Jesus rose from the dead and after Jesus rose from the dead. So before the dead, they were a little bit timid, not sure, doubting him. After Jesus rose from the dead, completely different. In fact, for those disciples, they died for what they believed in. Right, so something has to explain this change from not sure, not quite sure about it, to wow, I'm willing to die. Now let me be crystal clear about something. People die for what they believe in all the time. People die for what they believe in all the time. Right? Terrorists die for what they believe in all the time. But no one dies for what they don't think is the truth. Terrorists die because they believe in it, but they also think it's true. It's one thing to die for what you believe in. It's another thing to die for something that you believe is not true. The disciples died, and they died for what they believed in, obviously, and what they thought was true, most importantly. All right, so the second fact. So first fact, Jesus died due to crucifixion. Second fact, the disciples themselves believed it, that Jesus died and rose from the dead. Third fact, conversion of Paul. Something has to explain why Paul was converted from a non-believer to a believer. So keep in mind what we know about Paul. You probably heard this before. Paul was sort of the super Jew, if you will. He was like Eric Simpson times 10. Right? He had everything dependent on the fact that he was very high in the non-Christian community. I mean, he had his paycheck and his family and his friends and his organization. He had a lot to lose. Think about it as a Christian, how difficult it's just to lose going up here. If you tell your parents you're not going to go to church, that's a big deal, right? Imagine if Pastor Eric did it. Now, Paul was even like I said, example, 10 times as much as Pastor Simpson. So he's a very, very well-connected person in the anti-Christian community. In fact, he was torturing Christians. Some of you probably know that. So something happened to think Paul went from a very pious, zealous Jew to a believer in Christianity. Second thing, let's keep in mind, how do we know Paul believes it? Paul had a first-hand account. So we know after Jesus rose from the dead, Paul saw him. So this isn't like a friend of a friend who heard. I mean, Paul saw the risen Jesus, right? So that's important. This was first-hand information. And finally, there's 8 independent sources that said that Paul saw the risen Jesus. 8 independent historical sources. You want to see me afterwards? I can give you the actual references. A bunch of Greek and Old Testament writing, but 8 independent sources. So we're pretty clear that Paul converted because of what he knew about the risen Jesus. Finally, it ended poorly yet again. Right? So Paul, no less than 7 times, was beaten, imprisoned, tortured, and martyred for what he believed in. Again, and what he thought was the truth. People die for what they believe in all the time. People don't die for what they think is not the truth. Paul paid the ultimate price for this. All right. Fact 1, we know Jesus died. Fact 2, we know the disciples converted. Something caused them to convert. Fact number 3, Paul converted. Fact number 4, conversion of James. So James, as you know, is Jesus' brother, and he was no slouch. So if Eric is, or Paul is Eric Simpson times 10, James is Eric Simpson times 5, right? So he's got his own congregation. He's actually a judge, very much believes in the old, is a Jew, doesn't believe in necessarily the Christian, or is not a Christian. So he also had a lot to lose as well too. What I think is most interesting about Paul's conversion is he's a brother. So think about it. If you have a brother or sister comes down and says, "Yeah, I'm God, I'm Jesus," you're like, "Dude, you don't even pick up your room." Right? You still do. You still smell. I mean, you do all kinds of crazy. This is a brother. If anybody's skeptical about Jesus being God, it's him, right? So keep in mind, he has reason to be extremely skeptical. He's a brother. Finally, common theme, it ended poorly yet again. So once again, James was martyred, died not for what he believed in, probably that too, but also because he was believed it's true. All right, so fact number 1, Jesus died due to crucifixion. Fact number 2, the disciples. We have to explain the fact that something happened to the disciples before and after. Fact number 3, we have to explain that something happened to Paul, some change before and after. Fact number 4, conversion of James. Right? So we have these 4 facts, and we have to be able to explain those 4 facts. So here's 4 facts, and now we have to say, okay, what best fits those facts? What story? But because I like you, I'm going to give you an extra special bonus fact. Now, just to be crystal clear, this fact is not unanimously agreed upon. Right? So I told you that. You might think I'm dishonest. I'm going to be very clear. This fact is attested to by about 75% of the scholars. So just to be clear, not all of them. It's 25% roughly that don't do it. And by the way, this statistic about 75%, how they got these numbers was they looked at every piece of literature published on the topic, and they simply drew their conclusions, or they looked at the conclusions and then divided them. Wow, 75 out of 100 think there was an empty tomb. That's how they got the numbers for those that are curious. So 75% believe this fact that the tomb was indeed empty. Okay, why is that important? Well, or what's some facts supporting that? First of all, if the tomb wasn't empty, this is very easy for the Roman authorities. They simply show the body, right? This is, you probably heard this, easy to dismiss. Just go show if Jesus didn't rise, just roll aside the stone and show him the body. That clearly say, well, see, he's right here, he didn't rise. Very easy to disprove. Second thing that I call is when enemies tell the truth. So in the Bible, it talks about the Roman leadership accusing the disciples of stealing the body. So think about that. The Roman leadership is accusing the disciples of stealing the body. if there was a body there, they wouldn't have accused them to steal the body. Therefore, the Roman authorities must have thought the tomb was empty. Right? Again, these people, they could have just gone, again, show the empty tomb. So they knew the tomb was empty, or they wouldn't have accused someone else of stealing it. Right? So the Roman authorities knew that the tomb was empty because they accused the disciples of stealing it. Finally, I have this line in here, they were not very nice to women. Why is that important? Because women are the ones, as you know, that discovered the risen Jesus, right? Keep in mind, during this time, a woman's testimony was less than that of a thief, right? So they were, imagine putting someone on a witness stand that she is a known thief in your defense, you'd be like, I'm in trouble. The women at that time had, their testimony was worse, sorry women, it's back in the day, was worse than that of a thief. I mean, if you're going to make up a story, if you're going to make this story up, why don't you have a Roman soldier or a Roman general? I mean, let's make sure there's some truth to that. And so the fact it's interesting that the women found the Bible, it seems to me that that's not how I'm going to make up a story. If I want to tell a lie about something, I'm not going to say that woman found the Bible. I'm going to get someone of authority and say, oh yeah, this Roman general found the empty tomb. That'd be fantastic. So that's an extra special bonus fact. 75% of the historians agree, not 90. The other 4 were, again, just to recap, Jesus died from crucifixion, the disciples were converted, Paul was converted, James was converted. All of those died, right? Tortured, martyred. And finally, this bonus fact that you have to explain the empty tomb. So when you start to hear, when your friends say, well, maybe this happened on the cross, or maybe this is why Jesus, or how they can explain why Jesus rose from the dead, you have to be able to explain those facts. All right? Now that we have the facts, let's start to think about what best explains the evidence. So we're working backwards, right? I haven't invoked any holiness or spirit. I've just said, here's the facts. Now let's be clear on what best explains the facts. So I've got a little, let me back up here. So I've got a little table here, and we're just going to simply compare the facts with stories that you hear about that explain that how Jesus rose. Maybe he didn't really rise. Maybe Martians took him, right? Whatever it is, right? So across the top, we're going to say, what are the facts? Again, crucifixion, conversion of disciples, conversion of Paul, conversion of James, and this 5th bonus fact. Those are the facts. And then we're going to talk about different stories or explanations that people use to try to explain the facts. Okay, so we're going to compare them. First one is legend. So what this means is you hear a lot of times people say, well, Jesus didn't really rise from the dead. That's just like it's a story that's been embellished over time. It's the telephone game. I told you, you told it. By the time it gets to the end, it's no longer true. Like the campfire type story. Those type of things. Okay, so would that explain the crucifixion? Wouldn't explain the crucifixion. We got someone dead. This isn't a campfire story. Jesus is dead. What about the conversion of the disciples and Paul and James's brother? It's like, no. Paul's like, I saw the risen Jesus. I mean, I saw him. Right? Enough with the campfire stories. Right? This isn't going to cause me to be tortured and martyred and for my faith. Right? Campfires are great. I'm not willing to die for a campfire. And by the way, I saw the risen Jesus. And finally, it doesn't explain the empty tomb. It's great you told a campfire story or a legend, but we still have got an empty tomb. We've got a dead Jesus. So this sort of a legend, you hear that a lot. That's come out of prominence the last couple of decades because it's just not believable. It doesn't explain the evidence. Finally, another one you hear is this, Jesus was not the first. This is a zeitgeist. Hey, well, back in the day, there was some ancient Greek god who sent his son down to the earth, and he rose, and by the way, he was born of a virgin, and he died. Therefore, that what you hear about Jesus' resurrection is just another example of that story. It's like Jesus is just copying, right? That's a real popular one. So, problem with that is, great, got to explain a dead Jesus, right? Got to explain the fact that Jesus died crucifixion. It's great that Isis or Osiris or Zeus, right, has some great story, and they were born of a virgin and died on a cross and were resurrected. That's great. What's that got to do with a dead body on a cross, right? What's that got to do with the fact that the disciples and Paul were converted? You see it doesn't make sense. I mean, Paul saw the risen Jesus. It's great that Isis had some story back in Egyptian time. It doesn't mean that this one's not true, right? Finally, it doesn't explain the empty tomb. great Egyptian god who died, or Zeus or something, but we got an empty tomb here. We got to explain the evidence. And let's be intellectually honest. Right? Let's look at the facts and figure out which story best explains the facts. Right? Another one is apparent death theory. This is a very popular one. Right? Jesus never really died on the cross. Right? He sort of fainted, swooned theory. You hear all kinds of names for this thing. He never really died. Right? Now that would explain the first one. Maybe we fooled the Roman soldiers. Maybe he wasn't really dead. Okay, that would work there, right? What about these three? So imagine if you're a disciple or you're Paul, and Jesus died, and all of a sudden 3 days later he's walking around. He walks up to you, and he's like, "Hey, I'm the risen Jesus." And imagine what he looks like, right? He's been beaten, stabbed. Some of you saw the movie The Passion. Not good, right? He's got a spear mark in his side, legs broken, questionable, right? Looks terrible. He's like, "Hey, I'm the risen Jesus." You're like, "Dude, you look terrible, right? You're clearly not a risen God. I mean, these people aren't idiots." Paul's like, "What? You just look like you just rolled back the stone. You look terrible. These guys aren't going to believe this is the risen Jesus. Right? They're going to look like a guy who just was tortured and put in his tomb for three days." So it doesn't explain that. It does explain the empty tomb, though, right? So it does explain the fact that Jesus somehow rolled. And we want to talk about the empty tomb later and how those things were actually designed. I have a picture of one coming up at the end if we have time. So it doesn't explain how Jesus rolled back the stone. Or it does explain the empty tomb, but how he rolled back the stone is another thing. So this one explains the fact that Jesus died in the empty tomb, but doesn't explain any of the intermediate stories about, hey, wow, this guy doesn't look like the risen God. It looks like a guy that's been tortured. And finally, there's a whole series of theories about hallucinations, delusions, vision. Maybe they all saw it. Remember, Jesus appeared to the disciples, he'd appeared to Paul, and he appeared to 500. And so there's a lot of theories. Well, maybe they all hallucinated. Okay, it's important to remember things like about dreams and hallucinations. Those are individual phenomenons. Right? So what happens is, if you ask people throughout time, they all don't hallucinate the exact same story. It just doesn't happen. Think about it. Think about your dreams, right? These are very individual type things. To get all of the disciples and Jesus and the 500 to hallucinate or have a vision of exactly the same thing, you're on very intellectually shaky ground because there's no evidence for that. And we know that today. Just think about your own stories. You might have a similar dream, but when you get into the details, right? Well, chance of you having a similar dream as someone else, maybe, but the details, very, very rare. Now we got 500 people. Very, very difficult to get them all to hallucinate to see the same thing. This theory has been thrown out and discredited recently because it's just very difficult. They have a tendency to go back to some of the other things and dispute those, but the fact that everyone had the same vision, not necessarily true. Now, the fact that Jesus rose from the dead, this, I think, is best explained by the evidence. Like we talked about, fact number one, the crucifixion. We know that Jesus died on the cross. 5 independent historical evidences. Be careful you start throwing those away because you're going to throw away your whole history book or a good chunk of it. Second thing, the disciples were converted. They died for what they believed in, but more importantly, they died for what they thought was the truth. Got to be able to explain that. This theory does, right? Jesus rose from the dead. That's the theory. Finally, Paul's conversion. This explains Paul's conversion very nicely. Yeah, he was converted because he saw a risen Jesus. That'll do it. Right? That's a good one. Finally, fact number 3. Fact number 3, James's conversion. Brother had a lot to lose. He was a brother of Jesus, very skeptical. That obviously explains that. And finally, the empty tomb is explained by the fact that Jesus rose from the dead. So if you look at the facts and you think which story best fits the facts, the risen Jesus makes the most sense. Now, there's other theories out there. Before someone entertains and gives you, hey, what did this happen? Did Martians happen? Just ask yourself, just apply the facts. All of the facts. Not one of the facts, all of the facts, and see if the theory still holds up. All right. So the point is, if you look at the historical facts and you think about which story best explains the facts, historical story, the fact that Jesus rose from the dead. All right, a couple more slides. So how does this impact you today? I mean, interesting, but how does it impact you today? I want you to think about something. we at Eagle and these Christian communities are very good at feeling Jesus in our heart, right? It's very important. Again, like I said earlier, we listen to K-Love, and we go to small group, and we go to mission trips. Fantastic stuff. Very, very important. But I want you to know, so equally important is your head knowledge, right? In other words, you need to think about this. God created this universe. Don't be afraid of the facts. It's great you feel Jesus in your heart. That's fantastic. But realize there's a logical, oftentimes scientific explanation for your faith. Don't be afraid of that. Because the challenges will come, right? You're going to be thrown on your heels. Someone's going to, did he really live in a whale's belly for 3 weeks? Did he really walk on water? Did he really build an ark that large? Was that flood local or global? I mean, these type of questions are going to come. So just be ready. I want you to know, they're going to come, and be ready for them. That's okay. If our God is true, which he is, and he created the universe, we should be able to explain that. And there's plenty of really good arguments about these things. So I want you to know, think to the challenges will come. A lot of kids go to college and they lose their faith because they get thrown in their heels because someone asks them a tough question, right? That's okay. Get some help. Ask some people. Finally, always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that is in you, that you have. Okay, this is I like this because I'm an apologetics guy. This is from 1 Peter. Basically, make sure you can explain why you believe what you believe, right? That's the key take-home message here, one of the key take-home messages. All right, so just to sum it up real quick, I hope you see that there's 4 historical facts. You can debate those historical facts, but realize what you're going to have to throw away with those historical facts. And then we talked about which story best fits those facts. And clearly the risen Jesus, I think, fits those facts particularly. Take-home message, use your head and your heart. Challenges will come. That's okay. He created the universe. He can do it, right? He can explain these things. If you have any questions, get some help. All right? I'm good. All right, let me close in prayer, and then we can take it over from there. All right, dear Father, thank you for this opportunity to talk about your message, and we hope everyone listens understanding that this is both a head challenge and a heart challenge. In the head challenge, you can take the question. You're not afraid of the questions. You created the whole universe. That we hope these students realize that follow their heart, but also follow their head. In name we pray. Amen.